The coolest sport on ice fishing, New Jersey. Hello everyone, my name is Keith Greglak. I'm Senior Biologist for New Jersey Fish and Wildlife. I'm also a self-proclaimed ice fishing junkie. Why do I like ice fishing so much? Well, one, it's beginner friendly. You don't even have to know how to cast. I've taken countless people out to catch their very first fish on the ice. It also levels the playing field. No need to have a fancy boat, no need to have expensive equipment. It really levels the playing field. I can bring as many friends as I want. I don't have 10 kayaks to take 10 friends out. I can't take 10 people out fly fishing on the river, but I can take 10 friends out on the ice. But there is one limiting factor. One, is there safe ice? How much ice do I need in order for it to be safe? General rule of thumb is at least 4 inches. If you're going out on the ice and the ice is bending and water starts coming up out of holes, the next step is the ice cracking, and then you're falling through and going swimming. So we want to make sure we have at least 4 inches or more of ice. Why is the ice clear? Why is the ice white? Which is stronger? There's many things that affect the quality of ice. Early season, when ice is first formed, there's no air bubbles in it. That's why we call it black ice. That's why it's clear. Later in the season, the ice turns white. A lot of that is because of snow melt where it refreezes, where there's more air. Generally, the early season ice is going to be stronger when the ice is dry, when the ice is clear. Now you notice sometimes you'll see cracks in the ice. Is that good? Is that bad? Generally when you see cracks like that, it's a good thing. That's because the ice is expanding. When ice expands, it cracks. If you're out there on a very cold day, you'll be able to hear that cracking go across the ice. Don't be alarmed. That just means we're building more ice. Later in the season, when the ice is wet, when there's puddles on top, when you have the white ice, that means there's a lot more air bubbles. It's not going to be as strong as it was earlier in the season. What affects the ice thickness? Well, most lakes in New Jersey have either some sort of spring or some sort of creek inflow. Both of them will affect the ice. Many lakes also have docks that have bubblers near them. That also will impede ice growth. Depending upon how close you are to a road, there might be some salt runoff. That will also affect the amount of ice. Also, as the ground warms up quicker than the ice does, which sometimes leads to soft edges. Many times during the early season when ice is forming, wind will rip it open and push all the ice to one side of the lake, making for unsafe situations. Other times that ice might refreeze, giving you a mottled ice. That ice might not be as strong as black ice, but depending upon how thick, may still be safe. Snow on the ice. That could be your friend, that could be your foe. It makes it easier to walk on, it makes the surface a little less slippery. It also protects the ice from melting. Snow is actually an insulator. Conversely though, it might slow the ice growth. And the weight of the snow can actually create a water layer, making it for sloppy conditions. All right, let's look at some mathematical equations here. If you remember back in 2021, we had a major blizzard across North Jersey that dropped 30 inches of snow. With a 10-to-1 snow ratio, that's equal to about 3 inches of water. Now, a gallon of water is roughly 231 cubic inches, and a gallon also weighs about 8.34 pounds. So a square foot of water on top of the ice is roughly 1.87 gallons. So a square foot of surface area on top of the ice is 15.59 pounds. That means an area 4 by 4 foot around the hole, roughly the area you'd be standing on, adds almost an extra 250 pounds of snow. So over a whole acre, that's 339 tons of extra weight. What does that mean in reality? It means that the heavy snow pushes water up onto the ice. You could have safe ice of 8 or 10 inches and still have water on top of the ice. The heavy snow might push that up on top. Now don't be alarmed, this could still be safe, it just might not be as comfortable. But you come back the next day, all that water that was on top of the ice, now that is exposed to the elements, will refreeze and be solid. Even when the ice conditions are safe, I still want to take proper safety precautions. Some safety gear I always wear would be a set of polar picks or ice awls. I wear these around my neck like a necklace. If I was to fall in, I can easily reach these to rescue myself. I also like to carry a spud bar with me, especially early season and late season when I'm walking out on the ice. In order to test it, I tap it against the ice every several steps. When the ice is super slick, without snow on top, I also like to wear some ice creepers. It gives me a little bit of extra traction. Also, if I'm out there fishing with a bunch of buddies, it's not a bad idea to have a throw rope with you. If you do happen to fall through the ice, the first thing you need to think about is you need to remain calm. It might not be easy to do at the time, but you need to take a few seconds to regain your breath. You want to kick hard. Use the ice picks that you have. Help use that to claw yourself back up onto the ice. Now, you want to lay horizontal and roll away from the hole you created. Roll back the way you came from. If the ice was safe getting out there, it should be safe going back to the shoreline. Now I'm out on the ice. I got to drill holes before I can start fishing. There's many different tools you can use to make that hole. Back in our grandfather's days, everyone had a spud bar. It's pretty much a big chisel that you use to break through the ice. Then people started using hand augers. This is a drill bit with a sharpened tip that has a handle that you crank by hand. For the last several decades, gas augers have taken over the market. But in recent years, the gas auger has been replaced by the electric auger. Now, if you already have a cordless drill at home that's 18 volts and brushless, you can just buy an auger bit designed for drilling through the ice. An auger bit like that you could probably get for $100, $150. If you don't already have that cordless drill, you might want to consider looking at a dedicated ice auger. Those run a little bit more expensive, probably closer to $300. Now, after you get the hole drilled, you're going to have a bunch of slush ice in the hole. So having a skimmer to help clear that out can help you. If you have a drill that can go in reverse, you can actually reuse the reverse mode to push some of that ice back underneath the ice, which will mean you won't need to use the skimmer. Ice shelters are not a necessity in Jersey, but as your journey into becoming an ice angler continues, it's always good to get some new toys. Now, they're broken into two different categories. One would be a flip over style, the other would be a hub style. The flip over style is built into a sled, usually has a couple seats in it already. They're extra heavy. They probably weigh about 90 pounds, close to 100 pounds with nothing in them, which means by the time you put your gear in them, they are going to be extra heavy to drag. They're also pretty bulky. If you don't have a pickup truck, you're probably not fitting one in the back of your SUV. They're also pretty expensive. They probably start around $500 or so. Your other style of ice shelter would be the hub style. This is a relatively new design that has taken over the market in the last couple of years. It's the same design as most of your modern hunting blinds. The only difference is the type of material and if it is insulated. They're much lighter than the flip over style. They're more compact. Once folded up, you put it in a backpack on your back. They're also much less expensive. It is important to keep your ice shelter anchored to the ice. This is especially true when it comes to a hub style shelter. If you not already possess ice anchors, you can buy a kit that comes with a drill attachment to make it easier to install. Before I even set my hub style shelter up, I prefer to have several anchors already in place. As I'm setting up, I like to keep the anchors connected to the shelter. This is done through a series of straps. Once I am completely done setting up the shelter, I will continue to anchor every single side. So it's the beginning of ice fishing season. Which lakes are going to be the first ones to freeze? Well, it depends upon certain things like location, the size, the depth, the wind, the elevation. Location, generally North Jersey, no surprise, is going to freeze up first. Now, smaller lakes and shallower lakes are going to freeze before deeper lakes. Lakes that aren't in the wind are also going to freeze a little faster. Looking at elevation, generally the higher in elevation you are, the colder it's going to be, so those lakes will freeze quicker. You can also use social media as a way to ask questions to find out if there's safe ice in your region. Another valuable tool you can use is our Fishing Explorer app that is found on the Jersey Fish and Wildlife's website. As you can see, you can zoom in anywhere on the state, and every place you see a fish icon, you can click on to learn more information. When you click on that fish icon, you can zoom into the lake and it'll give you all kinds of information, including what type of access there is and what type of fish you can find in the lake. Generally, the ice fishing community is a bit more free with information. If you go onto the social media page and post a question about ice safety, how thick the ice is, you usually get some people that will give you a quality answer. But still, nothing replaces going out on the ice yourself. Where in the lake am I going to want to fish? Well, you want to narrow down the locations. If you're fishing in a smaller pond that's only a couple acres, it's pretty easy. The deepest part of the pond is probably where most of the fish are going to be. If you're in a bigger lake, depending on what you're fishing for, is where you might want to concentrate. You might want to concentrate on the drop-offs, on the weed beds, or on the edge of the weed beds, or if you could find some sort of structure. Does weather affect the fishing? How does a barometer affect the bite? Do fish need to feed every day? We got to remember in the wintertime, the fish's metabolism has slowed down tremendously. They actually do not need to feed every single day. So to increase your odds, you want to be there when they're most likely to be feeding. Does the pressure affect how fish feed? Of course it does. When the pressure is dropping, the fish want to feed. It's almost as if when a storm is coming, what do humans do? They run to the grocery store. They go to buy their eggs. They go to buy the milk. Well, the fish are doing the same thing. They might be going out for eggs and milk, but they're going to be going after your jigs. So before a storm is one of the best times you can go. Conversely, on the backside of the storm, when the pressure is rising, is when the fish are less likely to bite. So you can see where I have circled in green. That's ahead of the low pressure system. You see how those circles are pretty tight? Those isobar lines are close to each other. That means the pressure is dropping. That's when they're going to be doing most of their feeding. You also see on the backside of a high pressure, there's also a drop in the pressure. That's also another time that the fish might be feeding. Now, one of the worst times to be out there is when the pressure is on the rise, after that low pressure system moves off. When the pressure is high, the fish are less likely to bite. There are many different tools and websites you can go to track the barometer, but many of them only tell you if the barometer is going up or down. It actually doesn't show you what the trends are. One of the weather stations I like to follow would be the Rutgers weather stations. They have weather stations all across the state. Now, if you look in the top right, that graph there is showing us the temperature and dew point. The middle graph there shows us the wind speed and the wind gusts, and the bottom one shows us what the barometer is doing. The x-axis all line up together, so I could see at the same time what the temperature, wind, and barometer are doing. Even when the weather appears to be steady, you still have fluctuations in the barometer. So let's take a look at the graph on the left there. You can see in the morning, the graph is starting to go up. So, you know what? I'm going to carry on with my day's responsibilities. But I notice, I'm taking a break at lunch. There's a little dip. Let me go hit the lake for an hour. Fishing kind of levels off. So I go back to what I was doing for the day. On the way home, I'll give it a little try. You know what? I caught a couple fish, but then they stopped. When I see that graph rising really quickly, I just stop thinking about fishing. But I still keep my eye on the website. Once that barometer starts falling, and I see it falling hard, that's the time I blow off all my adult responsibilities and go fishing. There's always time to beg forgiveness later. Now, even on days when the pressure's not in your favor, you can still have a good time right at the end of the day. When the angle of the sun starts getting low, when the shadows start growing across the ice, even on a bad day, you're still going to be able to put a few fish on the ice. Now, do you even need the sun at all? There are some types of night fishing you can do. I've caught plenty of crappie after dark. A couple things you want to remember. You want to make sure you got good quality ice. You want to make sure you've been on the ice in the daytime so you know it's safe. And you always want to make sure you have a partner with you also. Some of my favorite types of fishing is fishing for panfish while jigging. So we can look at catching sunfish. We can fish for yellow perch. And we can even fish for crappie through the ice. When it comes to jigging panfish, you're going to need a jigging rod. Most of these rods are 2 foot to 3 foot in length. There are all kinds of ice fishing design line, whether it's braids, fluorocarbon, or monofilament. When it comes to pound tests, I personally use 4-pound tests, but I know some people fish a little bit lighter when it comes to targeting panfish, such as perch or sunfish. One of the pieces of equipment I find as a must-have is some sort of spring tip or spring bob that goes on the end of the rod. No matter how light your rod is, you still want to have this piece of equipment that's going to really show a really light hit. When it comes to figuring out what kind of lures you should use, don't believe everything you read online. I've never seen a pickerel come out of a hole to eat a dry fly. I've never caught a bass on a big jig with a weed guard. When it comes to panfish equipment, when you're looking at jigs, For sunfish, I usually fish either a small vertical jig or a small horizontal jig. The horizontal jigs become a little more friendly when you're fishing with a sonar. When you're fishing for perch, they're a bit more piscivorous, so you might be able to fish something a little bigger like a jig and wrap or some kind of jig and spoon. The lighter the bite, the smaller you need to go. During that high pressure, remember, these fish don't need to feed every day, so we want to really coax them in with something small. You might be fishing jigs smaller than you ever thought possible. 1/72 ounce, that might be a size 18 hook. Go to a local sports shop that's up there in ice fishing country. They'll have what you need. You'll be able to see and hand select what you think will be best that day. Remember that through the ice, the fish don't need to feed every day, so you really need to coax them. For that, you need to have some sort of bait on your jig. A bare jig isn't going to cut it. So, you can fish spikes. Spikes is pretty much a maggot. Sometimes you can find mousies. It's pretty much a maggot with a tail. Most places you're going to be buying waxworms from. Little pro tip here. If you can't find waxworms early in the season at the tackle shop, most pet shops will actually carry waxworms too. Now when you buy these, they're usually in a small plastic container that has a habit of opening up in your pocket. So it's not a bad idea to buy a bait puck to store the bait in. It also keeps it thermally insulated. Now if you asked me 20 years ago, I would say that you definitely wanted the live bait, that there wasn't any good substitutes. But now there are plenty of different synthetics that you can also use. Now, if you're going to be fishing for perch or crappie, you might want to even, up your game and fish something a little bigger, like a fathead minnow. Jigging techniques. Most of the fish you're going to be fishing for are going to be found close to the bottom, so it's important to know the depth of your water. You can just drop your jig all the way to the bottom till your line goes slack, and then reel it up 6 inches to a foot, or you can use electronics. Now there are various jigging techniques you can use. One of the first things I do when I get to a new hole, I call it an aggressive jigging. That's when I start at the bottom and jig it till about 3 foot off the bottom, then I'll let it fall again. I'll do that 2 or 3 times, and then I'll just sit there and I'll hold my jig much more steady. By doing aggressive at first, I'm calling fish in from a distance, and then I'm going to try to finesse them into hitting by using very small movements at this time. Sometimes a non-aggressive fish requires you not even moving the rod at all. That's when I set up a rod holder on my bucket sometimes. I'll keep it steady and just tap the rod every so often just to give the jig just enough vibration to attract the fish to hit. This is the time you need to watch that spring tip carefully. You might not feel the hit. Even with the lightest rod, you might not see the hit unless you got that spring tip. The moment you see that tip start to bend, that's the time you need to lift up and set the hook. I'm always thinking about catching that next fish, even before I reel in the first fish. Once you find the depth, you don't want to touch the reel if possible. In depths of, let's say, less than 7 or 8 feet, you don't even need to touch the reel. While you lift up with one hand, you can pull down with the other hand the line and be able to get the fish up on top of the ice. Because we're not touching the reel, this means that we can get the jig back down to the proper depth very easily. Trying to see where your jig is and where the fish are? Without electronics, you might be staring down the hole. With electronics, you're just staring at your video system. If you become an ice fishing junkie, you're probably going to want to get some sort of electronics. Most people are going to use some sort of dedicated ice fishing flasher. But if you're already an open water fisherman and you have a fish finder that you've been using on your kayak or small boat, there are ways you can convert that over to ice fishing. Most of the brands actually have ice fishing transducers that you can purchase. One of the great things about electronics is that it can tell you if the fish are going to be hitting. It could tell you if the fish are staring at your jig and don't want to hit, or it could tell you if there's just no fish around at all. If you look at the flasher that's on our left-hand side, you see a bunch of different colored lines. Well, what does it actually mean? If you look at the line all the way at the bottom, the big thick red lines, that's actually the bottom. If we're reading the outside of that dial, it's about 11 foot deep. The colors up at the top, that's just some background noise. Don't need to worry about that. That thin green line, that's around the 7 foot mark, that's your jig on the way down. These are so sensitive, it can read that single little mousie or waxworm. Now you see that red line that's coming up off the bottom, that's about 8 to 9 feet deep. That's going to be your next meal. That's the fish. If you're dropping that lure down, you're dropping that jig down, and you see that line coming off the bottom, coming to meet your jig, that's when you stop looking at the fish finder and start looking at the spring tip, because that fish is about ready to hit. Now, if you see on the right-hand side, that's my fish finder, my open water one that I converted over to ice fishing. You can see the jig actually shows as a line as it's going down towards the bottom. You can see the bottom is a hard line at about 11 foot. You can also see now the fish when it shows up on the screen in relation to the jig. So it's pretty sweet that you can see how the fish actually reacts to the jig. You're almost trying to tease it off the bottom. So as you bring that jig up, you can see the line following your jig. At that point, you gotta remember to stop looking at the video screen and to start watching that rod tip. I see that rod tip bend, you set the hook, the fish laughs because you missed as you see your jig come as a straight line back up to the top. The nice thing about this too is as you're dropping back down, sometimes the fish follows it up and it'll be mid-depth. At that point you realize you don't have to go all the way back down to 11 foot. The fish might be suspended at 5 and you might be able to drop down there and get that same fish to hit again. Without the electronics, it's hard to be able to see all this. Electronics can become expensive, so help a brother out. You can share the same electronics in 2 holes. The most important thing is being able to set that depth. Once you got that depth set, you should be able to hook the fish relatively easily. So by having it close to 2 holes, you can swap the transducer from one to the other. Sometimes if the holes are close enough, you can even pick up both jigs on the screen at the same time. How many holes do I really need? Well, it depends upon how you're getting through the ice. If I had a spud bar, if I had a hand auger, I'd probably be drilling just the bare minimum. But if I got a power auger, I'd drill more holes than I actually need. I like to cover lots of ground. I like to try to develop a paper route. Some holes will outproduce others. Even they might be 10 feet apart from each other. But just the way the weeds are, one hole might be better than the other. But you might catch 6 or 8 fish and then the hole shuts off. I move to a different hole, I find more fish. But still, there's usually 1 or 2 holes that are better than the rest. Now remember I said before that when the sun is setting, once that sun gets right to the tree line and the shadows start going across the ice, that's when you get a really hot bite. At that point is when I'm going to go back to the holes I already had the most success. That's how I'm going to put more fish on the ice. Some days it all comes together and you crush them. Other days you might walk off empty-handed, but at least it was a good day out in the great outdoors. So we've talked about jigging. Now tip-ups, that's the other big thing that people use to catch fish through the ice. Now you're allowed to have 5 fishing devices total. So that means either 1 jigging rod and 4 tip-ups or 5 tip-ups total. Now remember when you're using a tip-up, you have to have your name and address written on them. Tip-ups are used to catch our larger predatory fish. One of the most common caught through the ice is our chain pickerel. The other large predatory fish that would be caught on tip-ups would be the largemouth bass. The tip-up is an unmanned device that you can watch from a distance. It has a spool that is held underwater so it doesn't freeze, and it has a flag that's above the ice. When the fish hits, the spool turns and the flag goes up. You can see this from a distance and you know you have a fish on. There's a difference between catching only 1 or 2 fish and catching a lot of fish, and usually that has to do about how the tip-up is set. It's very important that the bait is in the proper location. If the bait is too low and is in the weeds, no fish is going to see it. If the bait is too high, fish might see it but not be willing to swim that far off the bottom to get to it. So we really need to know where the bottom is and where the tops of the weeds are. You can use a clip-on weight, sometimes called a fish finder. You hook that on your hook, lower it down, you can find where the bottom is, and then we want to make sure we pull the hook up so it's going to be 6 inches to a foot over top that weed tops. Now remember that when you're setting this up, that the spool of your tip-up is going to be probably 10 inches or so lower than the surface of the ice, so you need to take that into account. If you have a button on your line, like a close button, you can set that at the proper depth. So after you catch your fish, you can reset it a lot easier without having to use that clip-on weight again. Now, if you have electronics, this is where you can really fine-tune stuff, because you can actually see your hook and split shot on the screen with that flasher and get that set right to the exact spot you need. Now I usually do this before I put the bait on. Once you put the bait on and start swimming in circles, sometimes you can't read it on your electronics as easy. So you just bought your brand new tip up. You're taking it out of the package. You need to put some line on it. You're not going to use your standard braid or monofilament. You need something that's going to be a little bit thicker because this becomes a hand line now. You also want something that's not going to get tangled if it's laying on the ice. So you're going to use some sort of Dacron or some other ice line that's probably going to shed the water. 20 to 30 pound test is what I would recommend. Now you're going to need some sort of sinker or a split shot, probably something around 1/4 ounce or maybe a little heavier like a 1/2 ounce to be able to get you down. I'll sometimes use a barrel swivel to connect that ice line to our monofilament or fluorocarbon. I usually use about 2 foot or so of 10 to 12 pound mono or fluorocarbon. That's just for a basic multi-species rig. If I was going to be targeting perch, I might go a little bit lighter. If I was going to be targeting pickerel or pike, I might go for a little bit heavier leader. Generally, I'm going to put a size 6 to size 2 single hook on there. You can use a treble hook also, but you can't have more than 1 treble hook on your tip-ups. Generally, on your tip-ups, you're going to be using some sort of live bait, whether it's medium or large shiners or fat heads. I generally like to hook them in the back, just behind the dorsal fin. One of the nice things about tip-ups is you could cover a pretty big area simultaneously. So how many holes do I really need? Well, it depends upon if I have a power auger or a hand auger. If I have a power auger, I'm going to drill out more holes than I really need. If I have clear ice, black ice early in the season, I could see through and see where the weed beds are. I'll be drilling my holes right where there's a gap in the weeds. If I'm fishing along a drop-off, I'll drill some holes on the top of the drop-off where it's shallower. I'll drill some holes at the bottom of the drop-off where it's deeper, and I'll have some holes drilled where on the side of the drop-off. That way, if certain areas producing more, I can move the other tip-ups that aren't producing to the hotter area. Also, you got to think about, now I have my holes, I have my tip-up set up, where am I going to sit? You want to try to sit on the upwind side, so now you got your back at the wind, so you can see all your tip-ups easily. This is the same thing if you got an ice shelter. You're going to want to sit on the upwind side. There's something that never gets old when you see that flag go off from a distance. You want to run and get there as quick as possible. If you have kids, they're probably going to beat you there. But there's no need to really race there really quickly. While you're getting there, you want to look to see if the top of that tip-up's spinning. Sometimes the fish has barely turned it and it's still straight down. Other times the fish might have run 20 or 30 feet of line off and stopped. So when I get to the hole, I want to look down, see what the line's doing. I want to take the spool and spin off some extra line, so when I pick the tip-up up, the fish won't feel any resistance. So I want to slowly pull that line through my fingers and feel if there's any resistance. I'll keep pulling it slower and slower until I feel that resistance. If you feel a little bit of resistance, stop pulling and see what happens. If the fish starts to pull a little bit, now's the time to set the hook. It's a quick snap of the wrist to set the hook. Now you want to make sure you're pulling it in hand over hand. Make sure the line doesn't wrap around your hand, because that fish makes a big run. You want to make sure it's not wrapped around your fingers. Remember, your hands are part of the drag system at this point. You want to make sure you're on the opposite side of the hole the fish is running. Now, depending upon the size of the fish and the size of the hole is how easy the fish will come up on the ice. Smaller fish, like a perch or a crappie, you can just pull the line and flip it up onto the ice. A larger fish, you might need to stick your hand in the hole and help ease the fish up onto the ice. Once you get the fish up there, take some quick victory pictures and put it back down the hole if you want to release it. The alternative to putting the fish back down the hole is to put the fish into a frying pan. Fish caught through the ice is firmer and whiter. It just tastes that much better. Many people that don't keep fish throughout the summer will keep fish through the winter. I've already covered some of the most popular game fish that people fish through the ice in New Jersey. But what else can I catch? Well, anything that swims that lake you could catch in the summertime, you can also catch in the winter. Muskie and pike become popular to catch on tip-ups by using larger bait. Some of our lakes that have walleye become a popular winter quarry. We have a winter trout stocking program. We have a landlocked salmon program. We even catch catfish and bullhead through the ice. There's really no limits on what you can catch. Ice fishing, though, is much more than just fishing. It's about cooking out. It's about having hot chocolate. It's about making snow angels, having snowball fights, building snowmen. But all good things must come to an end. When you see stoneflies coming up on the ice, when you start rolling your sleeves up because it's getting warmer, when the sun's rays are getting higher in the sky, you know the end is near. Whether the fish are big, whether the fish are small, whether you're old or whether you're new, ice fishing is for everyone.